Good morning. We'd like to begin. If you could please take your seats. Good morning. I am Eliza Rubin Kershan. I'm the Senior Vice President here at UJA-Federation of New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our building, which we consider a communal home, a reflection of what UJA-Federation is all about, and our overriding commitment to support and strengthen the Jewish community. We're particularly pleased to host today's conference, the final chapter, End-of-Life Decisions, How Families Navigate Life's Toughest Choices, because we deeply value our long-standing relationship with the Plaza Jewish Community Chapel, the presenter of today's program. In fact, I know that this is the 10th annual conference, and we're proud to say that we have supported all 10 of them. The Plaza Jewish Community Chapel was established in 2001 with initial grants from UJA-Federation of New York, the Jewish Communal Fund, and other concerned community leaders, philanthropists, and communal organizations. In the 10 years of its existence, Plaza has proven its ability to ensure that all members of the Jewish community are able to receive a dignified and respectful Jewish funeral, as well as critical resources to help with the often complicated bereavement process. The vision to establish a community-owned funeral home that reflects the Jewish values of caring for one another continues to resonate profoundly here at UJA-Federation with our mission of building a compassionate, interconnected, inspired Jewish community for generations to come. And thus, another reason why this conference is so important to us is because of UJA Federation's commitment to enrich the capacity of the Jewish community to provide vital care at the end of life. The primary goal of our end-of-life care initiative is to ensure that the members of the Jewish community who are contending with serious illness and nearing life's end are treated with utmost care, dignity, sensitivity, religiously, medically, culturally, and emotionally. Over 5 years ago, as many of you know, UJA Federation, in partnership with Continuum Hospice Care, opened the Molly and Jack Zicklin Jewish Hospice Residence in Riverdale. Today, over 450 patients at the residence and their families have been helped at this most difficult of times. We also established community-based regional care centers with 3 of the prominent human service agencies in our network, JBFCS, WJCS, and FEGS. They provide local care coordination, case advocacy, spiritual and emotional counseling for members of our community living with life-limiting illness. We are in our 7th year of funding creative and impactful palliative care programs in our network hospitals, and we are proud of our support for the Mount Sinai School of Medicine's palliative care program under the guidance of Dr. Diane Meier, one of this morning's distinguished keynote speakers. In closing, I want to honor the important place that Plaza Jewish Community Chapel and their highly respected annual conference holds in our community. I particularly wish to thank Al Engelberg, Chairman, and Harold Handler, President, of the Plaza Jewish Community Chapel for their strong communal leadership. And I also want to acknowledge Stephanie Gary, standing in the back, the Director of Community Relations, who is directly responsible for organizing today's conference and making it year after year a relevant, meaningful, and powerful learning experience for all who attend. I'd like to point out this brochure, which is in your packets, which lists the full bios of all the speakers today. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, who is currently the Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis and Senior Rabbi at Congregation Mount Sinai in Brooklyn Heights. He's also a real friend of this building, UJA-Federation of New York, a valued partner and leader in the Jewish community, and it's really my honor to introduce Rabbi Joe Potasnik at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you and UJA for the extraordinary efforts that you demonstrate in making sure our agencies can reach our people. I must confess it was a unique experience sitting with the directors of the Plaza Jewish Community Chapels. Every few minutes they kept asking me how I'm feeling. So I caution you before you answer that question, think carefully. Secondly, Stephanie Gary informed me that Plaza has doubled the attendance at these gatherings, and I want to take some credit for that because many years ago I was chaplain of the federal prison here in New York, and Rabbi, when I first came there I couldn't get a minyan, but I want you to know that after an intense membership campaign we were able to attract many more people, so that's why I say that you have to recognize me as well. Let me also say hello to Andy Fear, who is the Executive Director Emeritus, and Michael McFadden, who's Executive Director. Thank you. And all the Plaza staff, Stephanie and Al and so many others, for reminding us in your work that it takes a community to care for a community. And we are the beneficiaries of your goodness all of these years. What does a rabbi do in his free time? For me, it's reading the style section of the New York Times because I want to see what other rabbis are doing weddings and why I'm not doing them. And secondly, listening to rabbis give sermons. And I had the privilege of listening to one of Rabbi Wolpe's sermons recently. And he talks lovingly about his father. And he pays beautiful, beautiful tribute to him in a memorial address. And Rabbi, in it, you mentioned Chesterton, who said the most beautiful part of a painting is the frame, because it teaches you that when you love something, you have to learn to live with limitations, with boundaries. And that's why I think this conference is so very important, because all of us who love people know that at some point we're not going to be with one another. So how do we react as we get closer to those boundaries, that frame? That's an important issue that has to be addressed. And in talking about Rabbi Wolpe, I do want you to know that he was voted the #1 pulpit rabbi in America by Newsweek magazine. Recently, Newsweek went up for sale. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's any causal relationship between the designation and the decision to sell the magazine, but I do think he's most deserving of it. It's hard to find appropriate adjectives and accolades to describe David Wolpe. He's a great pulpit rabbi. He's authored several books, his latest being Why Faith Matters, and last night at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention, so many rabbis wanted to have that book, and we're purchasing it at the convention. I understand John Grisham wants a copy of that book. And I thought to myself, he writes all of these articles, 200 words every week for the Jewish Week. Matter of fact, I have people in my congregation saying, if he can do it in 200 words, why do we have to listen to 1,000 words from you? But I think of a story when the biographer of Churchill was asked to what do you ascribe the greatness of Churchill, he said 50% intelligence, 50% integrity, 50% independence. And the questioner said, but that's 150%. He says, you don't know Churchill. He's more than one person. I want to say to all of you, we're very privileged to have someone who's more than just a rabbi. He's certainly more than one human being, Rabbi David Wolpe.
Both of us, thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Potasnik, for that extraordinarily gracious introduction. I really do appreciate it. And I realized when I came in here that I wasn't wearing a tie, and all of you are. Not all of you, but a lot of you are. So Stephanie was kind enough to say, you can tell them I told you to dress down, but she didn't. It's actually because I, these days, live in Los Angeles. And, you know, the problem, I realized growing up in Philadelphia, let me just explain to you the deformation of Los Angeles, which is a more complicated place than most people think. I mean, 1 out of every 10 people in America live in California. It's not, you can't characterize it too simply, but I'm about to. The problem with Los Angeles is, and it's relevant to this conference, that there's no autumn there. So nobody sees the beauty of aging. There's only spring, so you're supposed to look 20 till you die. And that's the ideology of the place. And if they only saw that leaves could turn to gold and that there's some beauty in that, it would be a very different place. But they don't, and that's why I'm not wearing a tie. I haven't, well, as long as we're on the topic, this is irrelevant, but I do have a good not wearing tie story, and I offer it to you also because it involves David Ben-Gurion. So it's actually, it's very tangentially relevant, which is that apparently Ben-Gurion, when he went to his first meeting of the Knesset, got into the car and he was dressed as he always was, which was in his work pants and his white open shirt. And his driver said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, you're the head of a country now. You're about to preside over the Knesset. You have to wear a tie. And Ben-Gurion said, I don't have to wear a tie, and Churchill told me I don't. He said, what do you mean Churchill told you don't? He goes, well, I was in London and I was addressing the House of Commons, and I got into the car dressed like this, and Churchill said, you may do that in Jerusalem, Mr. Prime Minister, but you can't do it in London. So I guess I could do this in Los Angeles, but I want to begin by talking about end-of-life issues, first of all, by talking about our denial of end-of-life issues. Because the truth is that the remarkable thing is, even for people in this room, death has the capacity to surprise you. Nobody, I mean, everybody expects to die, and yet nobody is prepared for that phone call. You're just not. I've seen this again and again with people, with doctors, with hospice nurses, with rabbis, all of whom spend their time telling other people about death, and then facing death, all the accumulated wisdom that they've offered to everyone else seems not to help. And they find themselves in the position of Sartre's character in his short story, The Wall, who is about to be executed in the morning and realizes for the first time in his life that he lived as if he had forever. And so in that sense, death is a critique of everything that we care about, because death is the loss of everything you love. That's what it is. It's the loss of everything you love, of mountains, of books, of people, of everything, everything, everything. All the things that I saw walking along the street in New York, right, where there is a pageant of people and of goods, everything, it's all gone. Hausman actually has a poem like that about a guy standing in a town square who's about to kill himself. And it goes, good people, do you love your lives? And have you ears for sense? Here is a knife like other knives that cost me 18 pence. I need but plunge it in my heart, and down will come the sky, and earth's foundations will depart, and all you folk will die. Because they all disappear as soon as you die. Everything is gone. And when you realize that, even if you survive the experience, then nothing is the same. So I had two experiences like that. One was that I had about 7 years ago, I had a grand mal seizure and a brain tumor. And I went back to LA and I had neurosurgery, and for a long time, my favorite word in the English language was benign. Because that's what I found out several days after the surgery. And for a moment, I realized that my greatest fear at the moment was that the people that I loved would be left without me. I wasn't afraid so much for me, which surprised me, right? I thought that I would think about all the things that I didn't get to do, but it didn't work that way. Rather, I thought, look at the condition I'm leaving all of them in. That was the hardest part. And then a couple of years later, I had a different experience. I was diagnosed with lymphoma, which is in remission. It's not, at the moment, it's not curable, if it ever will be. And so I tell my congregation that we're all in remission, only I know it. And actually, my first reaction to this, I mean, after the diagnosis, was that I was, this will just tell you what it's, this will tell you how being a rabbi actually twists your outlook towards the world. As I sat in the chemotherapy place, because it wasn't in a hospital, it was a special, ward for people receiving chemotherapy, but as they first put the needle in my arm, and I started to get that poison that was going to save my life, my first thought, honest to God, was, I better get a sermon out of this. Because if I can't get a sermon out of getting chemotherapy, I belong in a different profession. But as I looked around, let me tell you what I didn't ask myself, because this is important in dealing with people who are going through this experience. One thing that I never asked myself was, why me? Because I've had the experience of being a rabbi and having people come to my office, and when something terrible happens, they invariably say, why me? But let me tell you what almost never happens. I almost never get somebody who comes to my office and says, I was born in the richest country in the world and I've never gone hungry. Why me? I grew up in a home with parents who loved me. Why me? In other words, all the blessings that we receive, we assume they're our due. You owe us that. But as soon as something bad happens, we say, how could you do this to me? And part of the task of anyone who is talking to somebody at the end of life is to remind them that the end of life doesn't define life. That your life is actually primarily defined by the blessings that you had along the way till the end of life. Anybody who writes a eulogy knows that. You don't spend the eulogy talking about the cancer treatment at the end. You spend the eulogy talking about all the things the person did in his or her life. And so the focus on the reality of the blessings of someone's life that are not stolen by the fact that it ends, right? The temporariness of something does not render it unreal. It just makes it temporary. But then everything is temporary. Everything, everything, everything. Not only people. Maybe the duration is longer, but everything is temporary. That doesn't mean it's not real. That's the first thing, is that to talk to someone about the blessings of their lives, and also, if you haven't read, and I'm sure most of you have, but if you've not read one of those books that every human being on earth should read, and I say this without exaggeration, which is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, you know that one of the many points, it's a short book too, you're not allowed to recommend long books. You can't say, oh, you've got to read War and Peace, but you do have to read Frankl, and I say this really with all my heart. If you've never read it, then you're missing one of the great experiences in encountering another spirit in the world that has a lot to teach us. Frankl was a survivor of the Holocaust and developed a therapy based on what he observed there. And I'm not going to go into that, but one of the things that he says is, people who are older, what they've done in their life is secure. And in some ways, they should feel better than people who are younger, because you don't know what's going to happen. But everything that you've done, every achievement, it's secure, it's yours. No one can take your past away from you. And so when you counsel somebody who's dying, if you buy into their attitude, which is this is completely a tragedy, then you reinforce the idea that it's completely a tragedy, as opposed to this is the sad, inevitable truth of what is really a beautiful and wonderful thing. But all beautiful and wonderful things, spring days, butterflies, people, they all end, just with different times of duration. Now, this obviously doesn't address the genuine tragedies that we deal with, the death of a child, right? But I'm talking about now for most of what we, I'll come to that in a moment, but for most of what we deal with, we shouldn't abet the idea that death is inevitably a terrible, horrible, tragic event. It is sad, but it is inevitable. And one of the ways that you can reinforce this idea that it's a blessing is by letting the person who dies know that this is the time in his or her life when they have most powerfully the opportunity to be a teacher. I study Torah every week with a 94-year-old man, and he has told me a score of times, no less, about how when he was in his early 20s and his mother was dying, she took his hand and said, "Don't be afraid. This happens to everyone." And 70 years later, he still remembers that lesson because she was wise enough and good enough to teach it to her child as she was dying. And I always tell people who are dying, your children are watching you. They're listening to you because one day they will inevitably be where you are. And you're going to be their greatest teacher. And this, by the way, this has a very beautiful Jewish pedigree. You know, each year on Yom Kippur, we read the story of Hananiah ben Teradion, who's wrapped up in a Torah scroll and set on fire, right? Part of the Hadrianic persecutions after the failure of the revolt. And his students say to him, "What do you see?" And he issues that beautiful dictum, that beautiful epigram. He says, the parchment is burning, but the letters are ascending to heaven. So a few years ago, I read a wonderful comment on that from Elie Wiesel. He said, "Poor guy's burning to death, and they're hocking him with questions. Can't they leave him alone? He's not suffering enough. They have to say, well, what do you see now?" But then he said, "But I realized that as he was dying, the most important thing that they could say to him, his students and his disciples, is, you're still our teacher. And how do you let someone know that he is your teacher? You ask a question." And the same thing's true for people who are dying in our lives. They're still our teachers, and if we ask them a question, then we let them know that. And one of the things that I encourage, I always, when I'm with someone who's dying or who's sick, I ask them, what do you think happens after you die? What was the most important thing you did? What do you want to leave behind? What would you say to your children if you could only say one thing or two things? In other words, you open the door for them to teach. Because sometimes for someone to think of himself as a teacher is a revolution in their own self-consciousness. They don't think of themselves that way. But they're going through the most profound and the most inevitable human experience. And, you know, it's what the Greeks used to say about Plato. Whatever road of life you walked on, you found him on the way back. So they're the ones who can tell us. And that ability is not only something that people have, but something that all of us recognize. You know, when you get things like the last lecture from this guy who was dying of, and it went all over the internet, and then it became a best-selling book. Why was it so powerful? It was so powerful because he was dying. He could have given that same lecture, and if he was a healthy man, would not have had anywhere near the impact it did. But we, too, feel some mystical ascription of wisdom and importance. That's why people's last words have such power. My father asked me as his last wish to do this, and therefore I must do it. Now, maybe your father asked you to do 1,000 other things in the course of your life, like take out the trash, and you didn't do that. But these are his last words, so I got to do it. So when you let someone who's dying know that they have this power and this ability to teach, then it's not just, oh, it's all loss. And that's our job because they don't know that, because they haven't died before. The other part that I think is really incredibly important, and all of us say it in different ways, but I want to put it in a sort of larger frame, is that death is about the struggle that we all feel between material and spirit. I will mention one other book, not quite with the ringing endorsement of Man's Search for Meaning, but close. And if you haven't read it, I will give you the central thesis of it anyway, which is Ernest Becker's book from the 1970s that won a Pulitzer Prize called The Denial of Death. And Becker's central thesis is this, that we are split creatures who are trapped in a paradox. The paradox is that inside we feel immortal, but we are fastened to these bodies that decay and die. I remember when I was a counselor in camp, I used to say this where I was a division, I used to say this to the counselors. When a kid wakes up in the morning and he has wet his bed, it's not funny. It's the human dilemma, which is my body has betrayed me. And that's what happens to all of us sooner or later. You wake up and your back has betrayed you, or your blood cells, or your brain. And even the way you say it, my back has betrayed me, as though you are two separate people, lets you know that we're at ease in our bodies, but we're not at ease in our bodies because, you know, as Becker puts it, maybe not exactly in these words, he says, you can be Shakespeare and you can be sitting and writing Hamlet, and if you have to go to the bathroom, you have to go to the bathroom. It's a ridiculous paradox that we live with. And the final betrayal, of course, is death, which is why Becker said we spend all of our lives trying to deny the fact that we'll die because we can't stand the reality of it. We can't stand it. And so we engage in a billion different projects to deny the fact that we will die, including, if you think about it, what happens to Adam and Eve? Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, and they realize that they're going to die. Right? Remember, why does God kick them out of the garden? Does not kick them out of the garden for eating from the tree of knowledge. God kicks them out of the garden so that they won't eat from the tree of life. Now, why all of a sudden will they want to eat from the tree of life? Because they ate from the tree of knowledge, and now they know they're going to die, so they better eat from the tree of life. It's why the first thing that they do when they eat from the tree of knowledge, remember, is clothe themselves, because now they know their bodies. Once you know you're going to die, you realize you're a body. Once you realize you're a body, you know you're going to die. And then he kicks them out of the garden, and the very first thing that Adam and Eve do when they leave the garden is they have sex, and they have a child. Because children are, you know, our projectiles flung into the future, our attempt, as Becker says, to achieve the immortality that we can't achieve with our own bodies. And all of this is going on with someone who dies, and it's one of the reasons why we have to insist over and over and over again that not just children that you have literally, but children that you have metaphorically, people that you teach, people that you touch, they're all your immortality, and you hear rabbis say it all the time at funerals. Mazaro b'chayim afu b'chayim. As long as this person's children, their students, their friends are alive, they too are alive. What we don't say, but what everyone knows, is that children don't live forever either. Which is another way of saying, okay, they're going to live another 80 years. And that raises the real question of material and spiritual. And this is what I want to leave you with. Don't worry, it's not in a second. It's going to take a few minutes, but I don't want you to get too excited. But this is in some ways the central point of what it is that I think I can bring you. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a rabbi. And as a rabbi, I want to, for many of you, reopen the question, and for many of you, just confirm that this life might not be everything. We, as modern Jews, have forgotten the extent to which the tradition assumes an olam haba, a world to come. Many Jews, if you ask them, does Judaism believe in an afterlife, they'll tell you no, which I have to tell you is as wrong as it could be, just from the point of view of a historian of religion. It's just not true. It's true that the afterlife is mentioned very little in the Bible. It's mentioned, but very little. But it saturates rabbinic literature. And I want to say a couple of words about it and about why it is that it's so hard to believe. One of the reasons why it's so hard to believe the afterlife is that we try to imagine it. Forgetting, by the way, that you could never imagine this world before you came into it either, right? You couldn't imagine, you know, tuna fish and podiums and people and eyes and language and mountains and so on. And it's why science fiction always seems so implausible, because we actually can't imagine anything we haven't experienced. So the aliens have 3 heads, you know. But they're still things that we've imagined because we are extraordinarily limited by the capacity of our imagination. And also, we're driven by the conviction that only the material is real. If it's not stuff, if it's not synapses, if it's not cellular, it's not real. Despite the fact, by the way, that we all live on the plane of unreality all the time. Ideas don't have material being, but They're what we live on, right? If I ask you to point to love, you can't point to it, but we all believe that it's real. There are a lot of things in this world. In fact, the most important things are non-material, and we accept them as real. But when it comes to the idea